Okay, we are now live. Hi, hi everyone. We have with us today Baroness Bennett. Also, you may know her as Natalie Bennett, former Green Party leader and peer in the House of Lords. And yeah, Natalie's about to introduce herself, so take it away.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me along this evening. And yeah, and it's definitely Natalie to everybody. The Baroness stuff is definitely only for formal occasions when absolutely necessary. It's lovely to be with you this evening in the week of International Women's Day week. And for me, that's a kind of special week because I've been a feminist since age 5. So actually talking to the young green women yesterday, it struck me that I'm 55 years old, so I've been a feminist for 50 years. Which, when I say it like that makes me feel very, very old. But the foundation of why I became a feminist at age 5, even though I didn't actually know the word then, was because I was told, because you're a girl, you're not allowed to have a bicycle. And being a 5-year-old, my first reaction was to plead with my parents to have a baby brother so that I could ride his bicycle. But I also thought, well, that's not fair or right. And that was really, the point at which my feminism started. And right through my school years, my teenage years, my years in my early 20s even, I kept being told, not just that you can't do that because you're a girl, because you're female. I was actually all the time being told, you shouldn't want to do that because you're female. And that, built in me, I guess you could probably say a sort of innate bolshiness in that I was always fighting back against that, but also a real passion about justice and everyone having the chance to develop to their full human potential, not being putting artificial barriers in people's way, or indeed, barriers such as poverty, inequality and discrimination. And so that's why, I'm a feminist and have been one for 50 years. What I was focusing on in the speech this week was, I think it's been a long time green saying, I don't even know where it originates from, think global, act local. But I was actually thinking global this week because as we face the climate emergency, the nature crisis, as we look into the whole situation of a world that's profoundly fragile and on the edge, and where the future doesn't look like the past, and that's great news because our current economic system, our political system, has actually given us a world that's deeply, deeply unequal, poverty-stricken, insecure, with huge levels of mental ill health, while we've also been trashing the planet and creating a society that's that just doesn't work. And so things are going to change. And so I took the big view today, this week, when I was speaking in the House of Lords for International Women's Day, and kind of said, what does a feminist foreign policy look like? And that really means stopping backing the fossil fuel companies and what I've coined a phrase, which I think is quite a nice phrase, really. It's the fossil fuel finance complex. We know about the military industrial complex, but what you have when you look at it together, and there's been a lot of work done by green NGOs on this, on the link between fossil fuel companies and the financial sector. And despite divestment campaigns, which have made a huge amount of progress, particularly in many universities, we still have huge interlocking between those two. And we've got to get to a stage where we don't look at, the economics, the science has to be based on, I think Kate Woolworth's donut economics is a really great basis. And we also have to get away from an ideology of extraction, an ideology of exploitation, towards a situation. And the Green Party at the moment, we've fairly recently at our conference passed a motion on reparations. The way the world is now, I was quoting making myself very unpopular, I have no doubt, speaking in the financial services bill, I think it was this week, talking about how basically the wealth of the UK, particularly, the wealth of the UK was basically built on the destruction of the Indian economy in the Indian subcontinent economy in the 19th century. And if you look at the history of that, and it's our mining companies, our fossil fuel companies who will continue to do that. And our burning of all those fossil fuels, of course, is creating the climate emergency that's causing damage all around the world, but particularly in the global south, those countries that we impoverished in the first place. So we've really got to look at that world and say we have to do things very, very differently. And when when you get, you know, the nice Tories, the ones who mean well, sort of go, oh, you know, we're going to do good things about, you know, providing you know, modern contraceptive methods to lots of women, and we're going to do some, you know, some nice modest projects, even though they're planning to significantly cut the aid budget. But you know, the idea that we can just do these few little band-aid things and these are going to solve the problem just doesn't get you anywhere. So you know, that's the kind of things I'm focusing on. I mean, it's interesting looking back on this. I was only reflecting this evening before I was talking to you. I was going down through the amendment next week. We'll be debating for the National Security and Investment Bill. And I have, in my academic background, my first degree was agricultural science. I also have a degree in the humanities, was actually in Asian studies. My thesis was on the female prime ministers of South Asia. And I've also got a master's in mass comm, so essentially social science. What's really lacking from my academic stable is a law degree. And one of the things that the last year in the House of Lords has really taught me is, I was thinking tonight, I'm getting better at this whole business of reading legislation and making real sense of what this rather often very arcane, very technical legal language, what it means. So, you know, I don't think I'll ever do a law degree, but I'm kind of getting one by practical experience to some degree. But you know, looking at the National Security and Investment Bill, there's just so many issues that we're still so struck in such a narrow idea of what security means and where it comes from. And of course, security doesn't come from guns. You know, 2019, Britain exported £11 billion worth of arms out into the world. That is causing, you know, making all of it, as well as moral issues, that's making all of us vastly less secure. The world is choked with weapons. One of the things you have when you have a huge amount of weapons swirling around is they often tend to get used. And you know, a different sort of foreign policy, a different kind of approach to security would be looking at, well, you know, if that 11 billion went into things that we actually could and should be used, productive things, you know, obvious things like wind turbines and solar panels, and you know, good insulation for houses, and the skills and ability of all the people who were going into making those arms went into all those things to solve our real problems, how much better off we'd be. And that's something I was talking about actually in the Financial Services Bill. The whole idea, Sheffield, an organisation called SPERI, the Sheffield Political Economy Research Institute, SPERI, done some great work on the actual cost of the financial sector to the UK. And it's absolutely massive. It's a finance curse. And there's a whole body of literature known as the too much finance body of literature that really says, you know, I called it the Goldilocks level of finance sector, one that actually meets the need of the real economy, but doesn't start cannibalizing it. And we went past that somewhere in the 1980s. And you know, all the finance sector's growth has done since then has done us enormous amount of damage. So I guess I've come a little bit of a circle in the introduction there. You know, if I think back to my 5-year-old self fighting the system, you know, I'm still out there fighting the system, but I'm very encouraged by the fact. And, you know, when I speak to groups of young people, I often begin by saying, you know, I'm really sorry. I have to apologize on behalf of my generation to your generation, because we have collectively made a right mess of the world and the way it is and the world that you're stepping out into. But the good news is it is going to change. And this is a really crucial period. You know, we've had 35, 40 years of neoliberalism, neo-Thatcherism. One of the things I love is the fact that even the FT and the Economist increasingly are kind of writing articles going, this really doesn't seem to be working. We're really going to have to change things and do things differently. And, you know, Martin Wolf, chief economics commentator, certainly at least flirting with the FT, flirting with the idea of universal basic income, something I've long been passionate about. You know, it's obvious things are going to change, and they'll change in one of two ways. It'll change either, I believe, towards, you can call it green, but I don't care what you call it, but a political philosophy that says there's enough resources in this planet for everyone to have a decent life, provided they're shared out fairly. And if we do that, we can give everyone a decent life and look after the planet. Centrist politics is dead, because centrist politics means leaving things as they are. What you have as an alternative to our kind of politics is a far right kind of politics. And I'd say our current government is far right. A far right politics that says, oh, it's a dangerous, difficult world and there's not many resources in it. So what we've got to do is grab what we can for us and ours and shove the others away, whoever those others are. And one of the things it was interesting, I made an intervention, which I don't imagine was much liked with some of the population matters people, a question this week, pointing out that what we need to do is care for people and give them reproductive choices. And we also have to, and I'll give Zach Goldsmith credit, this, not something I do often, but he was asked about population and he said, well, what matters for green things is the consumption levels. So there is enough, provided some people aren't taking too much. So that's one side. We're on this side, and I'm sometimes asked, how do you know that you're going to win, that you're going to work out for you? And my answer to that is that I don't know. History isn't pre-written. History is made by the actions of what all of us are doing now. And so the question is now, what's happening? What are you doing as an individual? My top level message, I'll finish just talking on this point, is make politics what you do, not have done to you. We've had politics being done to us for the last 40 years. So get out, get involved, get engaged, get active, whatever it is that you're interested in, involved in. People say, oh, what's the most important thing to do? Is do what you're passionate about, do what you care about, do what you know about, do what affects you. Do that and do politics. And that's one way or another what I've been doing for 50 years, and I hope to keep doing it for a few years left, although one of these days I'm hoping to retire and go off and write lots of lovely women's history, but that'll be another time.
Yeah, that sounds like a nice retirement plan, actually. Yeah. That was a lot of really interesting stuff there. I think what struck me was kind of the enormity of what we need to change. Almost is it's manageable, but in the way you outlined, it's an almost it requires a multi-pronged approach and kind of almost cross-political approach and a global approach, which I found very interesting. But what I might pull you up on first is this idea you made, quite a statement, which I found a bit shocking, but I wouldn't say, when I thought about it, I don't think I disagree with it. But you said the centre ground is dead, I believe. So I'd quite like to, I've interrogated that a bit. Do you think basically then kind of the new Labour that we saw and that sort of politics is dead and gone, or did you mean that politics kind of isn't going to take us where we need to go, or both, really?
Well, both, but I think particularly it's not going to grab people, because if you look at, there's a survey that's been done over many years asking people, do you think your kids and grandkids will have a better life than you've had? And that survey is increasingly massively negative. So people get that we just can't continue as they are. The way things are going is things are getting worse all the time. Insecurity, young people unable to afford to buy a house, unable to even afford to, well, until COVID anyway, rent a room in a house in London. Life, millions of people. One of the things I get really angry about is, and you still get some Labour politicians saying this, what we need is more aspiration, and what we need is more social mobility. And what that's implying is that a few people might get out of a community, and everyone else is left behind. But actually, we need street sweepers, we need bus drivers, we need school dinner ladies. One of the things COVID has helped to highlight is the essentiality of all of these jobs. They are far more important than bankers, we'd love to rearrange things so we didn't have to deal with so many people in call centres, and perhaps go back post COVID to people being able to actually meet a real person and talk to them, and someone who knows your community and knows you and can look you in the eye and solve your problem. But we should be saying that I'm interested in ensuring that every job we need is decently paid, a real living wage, not George Osborne's fake living wage, but also that every job is respected. And I think we have made, COVID has had an impact on this. People have realized, boy, we really need those people in the supermarket stacking the shelves, because otherwise there's nothing on the shelves. And that's more crucial to me than, practically anything else at a certain point in time. We need the delivery drivers bringing all of the, delivering to all the people who are shielding. So people can, sorry, I think I've gone some way from the question, but the idea of centrism being dead is, centrism means essentially, by definition, we're not going to make any big changes. We're just going to, twiddle with the dials a little bit, change the settings slightly, whether you're centre right or centre left, one goes a bit towards equality, the other goes a little bit towards, but it's essentially leaving things as they are. Radical changes by definition is not centrist. I have seen people trying to claim to be radically centrist, but quite frankly, it doesn't make a great deal of sense, because as soon as you're saying we're going to make big changes, that's not centrism. And, there may be many reasons why the Lib Dems are not doing great in the polls at the moment, but that's certainly another measure of the fact if you don't stand for anything. And I think this is the Labour Party's problem now. And I think Keir Starmer has in many ways gone into the leadership of the opposition in taking the same approach as Ed Miliband did in 2015. And I took part in the leader debates. I saw Ed Miliband doing that then. I was right up there close, and the don't say anything too much to offend anybody, and then the keys of number 10 will fall into your lap. It didn't work in 2015, and whenever the next general election is, and I think there's a fair chance it could be 2022. It's not going to work for that approach then either.
Sorry, yeah. I think that's a very interesting point you made, and you've actually led into a question I was going to ask you really about when you mentioned the leaders' debates, because as you've said, like in our politics right now, it does seem to be, I mean, we saw in the 2019 election and 2017 election, it does seem that the gap between the left and the right has shifted, whereas before maybe you'd have had two parties that kind of were not so different in terms of policy and kind of both appeal towards the centre. It does seem now that people have firmly entrenched themselves in their own camps. Like we saw it with the Labour Party, arguably people would say that they're not as far left as the media claimed, but it was portrayed as kind of a very hard right or a hard left. And I think a lot of people like myself felt a bit uncomfortable, like we didn't really know. We got caught up in a bit of a culture war almost, and a toxic politics. So my question is really, and this can be a broad discussion, kind of, what has your view of the toxicity of politics been? Because obviously you were in that debate, and as I saw a clip, you were caught in kind of quite a passionate moment of debate between Ed Miliband and Nigel Farage, two very different politicians, and also you were with quite a strong group of female politicians as we celebrated International Women's Day this week. You were former Plaid Cymru leader Leanne Wood and Nicola Sturgeon, I believe. So what is your view of kind of politics and where it's come really, the toxicity?
I think, where has the toxicity come from? It comes from entirely understandable anger from lots of people whose lives are thoroughly miserable and insecure and can see no point and no hope of improvement. And one of the things I've always said about the 2016 referendum result, the first thing I'd attribute that to is first past the post politics. Lots of people in areas, particularly traditional Labour areas, that voted in Leave in very large numbers, particularly but not exclusively the north of England. Those areas were very much just utterly fed up. First past the post, Labour knew they could put anyone up with a red rosette on and they get elected. Labour was running a Tony Blair central triangulation, focus on the swing voters in the swing seats campaign, ignore our mainstream voters. They've got nowhere else to go. And that's what the first past the post electoral system has given us. And, I can remember actually just before the referendum, I was staying in a bed and breakfast in Darlington, and the landlady was a sort of very classic sort of, working, obviously small business person, but essentially working class by culture, passionate leaver. And, it was breakfast. I didn't really feel like doing the whole debate over breakfast with her. And so, it was something I do quite often, but particularly on this occasion, it was like, well, let's find all the things we can agree on. And, we agreed that the Darlington Hospital A&E shouldn't close down. We agreed that, the minimum wage should be a real living wage. We agreed that multinational companies should pay their taxes. And the problem was none of those were things that the Labour Party was saying. At that time, certainly in 2015 election, there'd been for decades, no one had been saying on that and trying to deliver on that. Labour didn't deliver that when it was in government. You know, one of the things that the Blair government did was it brought in the minimum wage, which was a very good thing and a significant advance, but then it allowed the value of the minimum wage to slide down and down and down. So we're now in the weird situation where it's actually a Tory government that's lifting the real value of the minimum wage up again. And the Labour government topped that up with family tax credits and housing benefit. But that just meant that, you know, giant multinational companies kept raking the money in. And it was only the government that was topping up people so they could live. And then you got the Tories who come in and cut away at the benefits, and you're in deep trouble. And so, you know, lots of people like that voted to take back control. And they haven't had control in their communities. And, you know, we also have, you know, people sort of don't really realize this. We have the most centralized politics, the most money and power and resources all focused on Westminster, and local governments now. I mean, I was talking about this in the House today in the budget debate. Local governments essentially now are being reduced to delivering only their statutory duties. So they're actually only an arm of central government, because statutory duties are what the Westminster government has made the law that they have to do. And so, you know, libraries, parks, all the things that make life worth living, that, you know, the old person who lives in a horribly bad, poorly insulated, drafty home who can't afford the fuel bills in winter, you know, at least if they can go to the library, that's a warm place to be. Now, you know, pre-COVID, but now the library's closed down. Where do they go? And so people have got so angry that that's where the underlying level of the toxicity is. But what you've got, of course, the problem you've got is that, you know, we see this in immigration, and it's a point I've long been making on immigration, is, you know, it's the boil's got off somewhat, but, you know, in 2015, immigration was seen as a really toxic topic, and certainly was in 16 in the referendum. And, you know, what I was going around saying was that, you know, if I ask people, you know, if you ask people, what are you concerned about? And they say immigration, and you say, what are you concerned about? And how does it affect you? They would usually say things like low wages, crowded schools and hospitals, my kids can't get a council house, housing's too expensive. My answer to all of those is none of those are caused by immigration. They're caused by failed government neoliberal policies. But the problem was both largest parties kept blaming immigration. You might remember Gordon Brown, British jobs for British workers. And so people were told again and again, immigration's to blame, this is what's causing you problems. And so that set up the culture wars that we're now very much trapped in, of toxicity. And, you know, I was just in a briefing today, and absolutely horrendous government bill coming through, being rushed through, almost certainly, well, certainly for the before the local elections, which is basically aiming to criminalise and make homeless Roma, Gypsy and traveller people, particularly traveller people, with a new criminalised law of trespass. And it's pure culture war. You know, the number of people affected will not be very large, but they will be hideously affected, and they will be the most disadvantaged people in society. And this will be brandished by the Tories as part of their culture war. So, you know, the toxicity comes from the anger and from the fact that one party is prepared to exploit that anger in a really, you know, I say we have a far right government, that's prepared to behave like Donald Trump did in the US. And that's why everything's so toxic.
Yeah, I think we're a non-partisan society, so I'm going to try and stay impartial, but I think I'm going to say that the media, it has been said, this is what I'm going to say, that the government have been seen as quite incendiary, and there has been a lot of high rhetoric in recent years on a lot of sides, definitely. I was just going to share with you, basically, because you mentioned a point on Brexit. I can very much relate to a lot of the concerns that you said, because coming from South Wales, my family are predominantly from the valleys. When I came to Cambridge, I'd have a lot of Remain people, and I don't have anything against Remain people. I wouldn't necessarily say I'm ideologically fully Leave either, but there's this kind of caricature, I feel like, in this society, and I'm not sure if you agree, of what a typical Leave voter is, kind of like a kind of xenophobic person who just doesn't like immigrants. But actually the whole issue, I feel, is a lot more complex, and I feel like you've brought that out. So I was just going to say really that, I mean, you can add on this, but based on where I come from, it does seem like you've said a lot of the stuff is that in Wales, there's been a highly centralized system for years, and a lot of people don't feel like the wealth has affected them since the mining jobs went. Like my mum's family were heavily mining, and then the mining jobs went, and then they worked on the railways, and now the railway jobs they're not as much. So I do feel like, as you said, and you can add to this, but it does almost feel like the situation we're in now, it's just because people are being left behind, I feel, by a government and they don't feel like represents them. And I was just wondering, kind of, what do you think we need to do, like, to get ourselves back from this?
Well, I guess I come back to the make politics what you do not have done to you. And one of the chief differences between our kind of politics and the far right kind of politics is we want to empower people. We want to operate and start from the, Green Party has always started from the lowest local level, keep power down at that level and only refer it upward when absolutely necessary. And we want to get out the word, deliver the possibilities. And we're seeing huge amounts of this happen. And, some of it's happened through COVID with, huge amounts of community support. People have rallied round together, helped the shielding neighbours, looked out for the neighbourhood. But there's also been, a huge increase in the amount of sort of grassroots politics stuff being done, community centres developed without any funding, but just kind of growing up in a neighbourhood, people deciding to guerrilla garden a bit of wasteland, all sorts of stuff like that's happening. And what we want, our side of politics broadly, and I'm not particularly being party political here, but the whole idea of community organising, the whole idea of empowering people, giving them the tools, giving them hopefully a little bit of resources if you can, if you've got control, say, of local government or something, give people the power to step forward and do things. Whereas, the far right operates on very much the different, and again, why they're happy to do culture wars is they try to frighten people, to wave bogeymen around and say, oh, these are these terribly dangerous people who threaten you, you're powerless, oh, you need someone riding up on a white horse to come to your rescue. And it's innately a focused often on a single person, driven in a way that says, you're a powerless, weak person, but this person on the white steed will protect you. Whereas we're saying, no, all get together, form a group, defend each other, support each other, help each other, and then you can stand up to an awful lot. And so that's the kind of nature of the two kinds of politics, which is why I always say our emotion is the politics of hope, their emotion is the politics of fear. And it's one of the reasons when we talk about things like the climate emergency, it's really important to focus on, the possibilities, what it means if you insulate every home that needs it, everyone has a warm, comfortable, affordable to heat home. Tackling the climate emergency means you've got solar panels on your roof, you generate your own electricity, you essentially become self-sufficient. All sorts of changes that empower people, give them control, see positive changes in their life. And, that's what we need to focus on.
Yeah, I do feel I agree with quite a lot of what you've said. It seems like from the politics that you advocate, green politics are more than just kind of, I think a lot of people around where I live have the idea of green politics as kind of like turning off your tap and not recycling quite a lot. That's kind of the basic idea that you're taught when you're in school. But I do feel like what you highlight a lot is green politics can lead to so many different other areas and can improve so many other aspects of lives. I was just gonna ask you, kind of, because I'm interested in kind of your anecdotal experiences. You ran, I believe, against a now leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer. Am I right? Is it in near Camden?
2015, Holborn and St Pancras constituency, which is kind of the southern part of Camden, more or less.
Yeah, I was interested to hear, really. I'm sure our viewers will be interested to hear those conversations in general when you were organising in the community, because there was a lot of energy, I remember, around that campaign at the time. You as a Green Party leader, it was featured on the news, and it was a high octane campaign for the Greens. I'm just wondering kind of what your energy was and how you felt being on the campaign trail.
Oh, well, if I look back to 2015, I mean, it was an amazing period because it was known as the Green Surge. I mean, basically the membership of the Green Party quadrupled in something like 5 months or something. And we went from, getting no media attention at all to having the media swarming all over us. And, one of the points where we essentially, 6 weeks out from the election, we had one press officer. That was the entire Green Party press operation, was one press officer. And, we so if you ask my primary state through that election campaign was absolute total and utter bone deep exhaustion, because everything changed. And it's suddenly how we got treated suddenly changed, and we suddenly started being judged on the same level as the Labour or the Tory party, and that was a pretty difficult place to be with the level of resources we had. But it was also tremendously exciting, and what I think we're only really starting. Well, we started to really see the fruits of that in 2019. And that was the last council elections that were held, because they were cancelled last year, and we doubled our number of councillors in 2019 in a single election. And I mean, we're now in a situation where we're again still as minority administration running Brighton and Hove Council. We are around the country in 16 administrations. There's various forms of rainbow coalition where Greens are part of the coalition running local councils. And the last democratic election conducted in the UK, which was the European election, the last one conducted under a democratic voting system, we got 12% of the vote, and we beat the Tories as the party of government into 5th place. And so what happened was 2015, we got crunched in the two-party first past the post crunch. Our top polling level, well, the top one I believed, I think there was one poll that put us at about 11%, but I didn't really believe it. But our top polling level, reliable polling level in 2015 was about 8%. And then we got hit in the last weeks with the two-party squeeze, when people started to look at their local seat and went, oh, well, I'm getting all of these Lib Dem, it's a two-horse race here type leaflets or similar. And but one of the interesting things is we are now in general election polling, even though we're essentially getting no media coverage. We're now polling at around 6-7% in quite a few polls, which is historically outside election periods absolutely astonishing. And it shows really what happens is, we've been able to build on and grow and develop, and we're happening at a local level. There's a huge amount of work happening at a local level, and we're going into the council elections this year, plus of course also the Welsh Assembly elections, and we've got a really good chance of getting our first representatives in the Senate. In Scotland, our sister party, the polls are looking really good for them, and they've got a huge level, having essentially held the balance of power for the past few years. They've got a huge level of track record of delivery, that they can show what they've achieved, and people are liking that. So all of this, the nature of politics is that you build things and they build up over time. But also, political change, it kind of comes to your centrist point. Political change doesn't really happen slowly and gradually. It's not a case that you start from here and over a number of elections you travel in a straight line and you eventually end up in a different place.
Yeah,
lots of pressures build up, and then suddenly there's a rupture. And the last real change in British politics was the election of Margaret Thatcher. Nothing, we've had neoliberal politics since then. That's now clearly breaking down. And we're heading towards a point where we have a level of change again, something like that change that happened in 1979. And I was only reminded, Craig Bennett, who's now the head of the Wildlife Trusts, and he and I were sharing a platform a week or so back, and he was reminding, I was reminding him that the first time we'd shared a platform was in 2012 at a fairly grisly debate with the Spectator, with an invited audience of essentially sort of Telegraph readers and people to the right of Telegraph readers. He and I were speaking out against fracking, and it was a fairly rough evening. It wasn't our audience by any means, but he recollected, and I'd forgotten, but that I'd said to him then in 2012 that I didn't really know exactly what it looked like, but I really thought British politics was going to break wide open and really change a great deal. And he kind of said, "Oh, I thought you were, I think you're right now." And I was like, "I think I was right, really."
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. I was just wondering, really, you've mentioned neoliberal policies quite a lot. I was just wondering for our viewers, because my understanding of neoliberal policy is a bit shaky at best, kind of what roughly, because we hear a lot of the time in the news about kind of how neoliberal policy is failing, kind of what roughly would you categorize under that kind of, almost as you'd characterize it, kind of this failing economic model?
Well, I suppose, my kind of, perhaps not quite one sentence, more or less one sentence to that is, it's a model that says the market is king. We all have to exist to serve the market. And, anything that interferes with the market is a bad thing. And every possible element of society that we possibly can needs to be swept into the market, because the market is efficient. The market does things the best possible way. That is where I would say, if you want a sort of simple explanation of what neoliberalism means, that's the underlying philosophy. Now, what that delivers in terms of policies is privatization. And one of my case studies I often cite, and if you want case to look at this, look at the Financial Times coverage of the privatization of the water industry, because it's hilarious how incredibly critical the Financial Times is of the privatization of the water industry. And what's happened is it was a natural monopoly. Makes no sense at all to have any idea of competition, but it was sold off. Most of the companies have been sold again and again and again and again. They're now loaded with enormous quantities of debt. They've paid themselves huge dividends. That debt loading has just basically shoveled money into tax havens. And they pay themselves, like 14, 12, 14, 16% interest rates. And it's just bleeding the country dry. It's just daylight robbery. And that's the kind of policy it's delivered. That's happened to our water industry. It's happened to our care homes. It's been increasingly happening to our NHS. People don't realise that just because it says NHS above the door doesn't mean it isn't actually owned by an American multinational health company. And it's also been that, we can't have regulation. And, the Grenfell Tower fire, that hideous disaster, and all of the subsequent problems that were found in so much else, neoliberalism says, regulation's bad, red tape bad, got to cut red tape. And that's given us a profoundly dysfunctional building sector that essentially can't construct a safe building. And that's by cutting away the regulation, because neoliberalism says rules bad. And, I many years ago was with the Hazards of Work campaign. I invited them to an event at Green Party conference, and I've never forgot, what they said then. It's just a wonderful summing up. Better red tape than red bandages. People should be able to expect to go to work and come home alive. That, and rules that do that, rules that say you have to make sure you build a building that's safe and doesn't kill people. But neoliberalism doesn't like rules like that. So that's what I'd say, that's where it delivers. And of course, it says that basically we've got to squeeze wages down efficiency. So, lots of people with, okay, I'll be polite, even though it's Friday night, with bad MBAs have been taught that, good management means cutting costs. You cut costs, you squeeze costs, you sack people. And that's what good management looks like. And that delivers, it's neoliberalism is also incredibly short term. It's about, the next quarter's figures. And what does that do to the share price? And therefore, what does that do to the boss's bonuses? And, we're up in, I think the last figure I saw was, the average CEO 270 times their average worker. They're just astonishingly, again, we're talking about daylight robbery. Those figures used to be something like 30 times as much, which I still think is still too much. But we've just seen this total explosion of inequality, and that's, at the nature, at the heart of neoliberalism.
Okay, so I've been trying to, as you've been saying that, I've been in my head trying to break it down, because I feel like that was quite a complex question for me to ask anyway. But obviously, that's kind of shown that neoliberalism does have several ramifications. So basically, I was just wondering, is what you're saying basically that instead of having an economy where market is king, as you've said, we should have an economy where people are king and where people kind of come together to contribute to that market? Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I'm often asked, so are you a socialist? And like, no, I'm a green. At a very basic level, a market, if we think of what's known as a market garden, if someone gets the lease or the ownership of 10 acres on the edge of town, sets up a nice little market garden, grows lots of nice fruit and vegetables, and brings them into the Friday market and sells them. I might have some preference for that being a cooperative that operates that way, but it's operating essentially through a market mechanism. I'm not utterly opposed to all forms of market. There are some things that markets work very well in. But what you have to do is say, what is the economy for, and how is the economy going to deliver? And so that means, what you have to do is, one of the other things about, which is true both of neoliberalism and indeed the economic systems that preceded it, is you have to recognize that there's, you have to count the real costs of things. And what's known in the jargon as externalized costs is something we've ignored for the last 100 years or more, ignored through the entire Industrial Revolution. When you think about, we've suffered enormously from huge amounts of pollution, and the factory owners never paid the cost of the pollution. Those costs were all externalized. So what you need to do is have a system that acknowledges that if you create some damage, well, ideally you create rules that stop the damage, but if the damage is absolutely unavoidable, then you have to make sure that the cost on the price tag, the cost on the company bottom line, is reflected. They're paying it. And at the moment, what people are doing is taking huge profits out of the system and putting, whether it's plastic packaging, whether it's air pollution, whether it's damage to soils, whether it's factory farming threatening our antimicrobial resistance, all of these things, people make huge profits from imposing massive, literally unbearable costs on the rest of us. So you have to have a system that works, and this is what I would say is the green system, that says we have to live, and my guideline is very much donut economics, Kate Raworth's book. You have to live within the donut. So you need to develop a system, and this to me starts with decisions being made at the local level, power and resources at the local level, and only referred upwards when necessary. Living within the physical limits of the planet, which is the outer ring of the donut, but meeting everyone's human needs, which is the inner ring of the donut. So if you live in that Goldilocks golden zone, the donut zone, that's where you've got to live, and you need a system that delivers that. And to put that into sort of concrete terms, the local and different referring power upwards. We're about to go into the COP26 climate talks. The world has to agree, collectively come together, each nation pledge enough to keep us below 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. So each country has to make its contribution to that, and we as a globe have to come together and put pressure on people to get to that point, or put pressure on countries to get to that point. But if you live in a village, in a town, in a suburb of a city, you get your allocation of that, which is it. But how do you do that? How do you deliver those carbon cuts? Should be decided locally as much as possible. So it might be that you've got a community with some fair bit of people with some capital, and you say, oh, well, we want to put up a wind turbine, and get all the, we'll use that electricity, we'll get the extra profits for the electricity we don't need. And if the community decides, and people in Britain often don't believe this, but lots of continental Europe, communities compete to get wind turbines, compete to get wind farms, because they get a really good, decent local return from it. And they see it as their wind farm. And they've also got a real control over the decision of where that wind farm goes. So it might be that in the village, maybe the best possible place from a technical point of view to put the wind farm is over on that hill, but it's right beside the castle, and it really spoils a view that people really love. So maybe if you've got proper community decision making, everyone goes, well, okay, if we put it over on that side where it's beside the power pylons, and it's a bit of a messy corner of our view, maybe 5% less energy, but we'd rather have it over there. And that's that kind of local control, local decision making. It's got to be the foundation, And it's interesting because there's a lot of really interesting work being done now. We had a climate assembly, unfortunately somewhat interrupted by COVID, certainly in terms of the attention it got. But deliberative democracy. So you bring together a representative group of local people, give them the time and the resources to deliberate, not just to vote in a referendum kind of way, but to actually sit down together, hear all the evidence, decide among themselves, talk among themselves, come ideally towards a consensus view. And if you have that as a foundation of decision making, then that's the way you want to go. Which is where, of course, you get to the issues of green policies being all linked together, because you talk to a group of politically active people now and say, oh, there's all this extra political work you should do, and they kind of go, I've got to fit that between my long working hours, my care for my children, my care for the older people because there's no social care, etc., etc. 4-day working week is standard with no loss of pay, eventually perhaps going towards a 3-day working week as standard. Universal basic income, so that it means if you get really passionate about something and want to spend a couple of years really working on that political issue, you can decide to do that with the UBI there supporting you. So these things are all related together. Democracy demands economic democracy, The Green Party has always said economic and environmental justice are indivisible.
That's really interesting. In my head, I quite like to relate back to something you said earlier. You talking about, I think, because you said you did a master's, did you in Asian, Asian?
No, my master's was in mass communication. So I actually
Okay.
I did a thesis.
Degree, sorry.
Yeah, I did a thesis on artificial intelligence 20 years ago, which is why I'm something of an AI skeptic, because 20 years ago, artificial intelligence was almost there. They were almost making it. And, 20 years later, it's a bit like fusion nuclear power. They're almost there. They're almost making it. They're just about getting there. But yeah, no, my second degree was in Asian studies. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask because in our last, when you came to our regional inequality talk, you mentioned in one of your answers about basically walking through a building, I think you said, and you looked at the marble and you looked around and you saw, I'm not sure if this is a story you've told before, you saw and you were like, you said, this wealth has come from, to yourself, this is what you said, has come from our empire, and this is where we got our wealth from. And I was quite interested earlier, the point you made that you reckon that politicians in the UK are saying that we're doing climate, we're trying to reduce our emissions and trying to rely more on renewable energy, which according to what I've seen, we are. But I'm quite interested to interrogate you on this a bit, because you claimed that, and I'm not disputing this, but you claimed that in India and other former colonial empires, colonial colonies, that basically we are responsible for a lot of the fossil fuel consumption and for a lot of the pollution that comes out of that, and that's something we haven't owned as a country. So I'm just wondering, do you think that the coverage of Britain kind of improving its reducing its emissions and improving its renewable energy is kind of should be focused less towards us and more towards kind of the impact we've had more globally?
Well, I think, one of the things, and I occasionally bang away at this at the House, is that the government brandishes its carbon reduction figures, but what it's talking about, and the UN does traditionally manage what's known as terrestrial carbon, the carbon that's emitted in the UK. So that means on that accounting, the washing machine that comes from China is zero carbon in Britain, which of course it isn't. And a huge amount of China's emissions, and everyone points to China as their emissions are going up very fast, but a lot of those emissions are actually producing goods for us. And it's crucial, and certainly the Committee on Climate Change is very solid on this, as far as they can possibly politically be. We have to count total emissions, as in the products we use, the products we import, and when you do that, our figures are much, much worse. And so there's a huge change there. But there's also, it's known in the jargon of COP26 as loss and damage, because the fact that Fiji is hit by a hurricane, or Central America is half wiped out by a typhoon or something, all of these things, or a Pacific island or something, all of these things, we made a significant contribution to. And that means both we have a huge duty to help them build cyclone resistant structures or whatever, to do the things they need to do. We also need to hand over the technology and the know-how and provide the support so they can go straight from not having any electricity, as they may be in a situation now, to having renewable electricity without having to go through a heavy carbon stage in the middle. So these things are morally right, but they're also in our own interests. I think we've made a kind of nice circle, so perhaps we're sort of coming to the end, circling around, talking about foreign policy, and that it's not guns and, goodness help us, nuclear weapons that make us safe and secure. It's a world in which everyone knows they can put food on the table, keep a roof over their head, have some hopes for their kids to have a decent life, a sense of security. A world in which we're looking after nature, in which the soils are cared for and the oceans aren't any more than we can stop it choked with plastic. All of those things are what give us actual security. Other people having a decent life makes us secure. And until we deliver that, we're not going to be secure. And we've been trying the guns and weapons approach for a very long time, and it's worked out very, very badly. So also we come back to the centrist arguments. It's trying to try something different. Centrism is dead, because continuing as we are in foreign policy, as many other things, just isn't an option.
Great. In that case, then I might have one last quick question.
Okay.
There's a lot of things you've said that we should change. If we're looking at one thing we can change now, looking in a world where COVID is beyond the horizon, COVID is behind us, hopefully, fingers crossed, and we're looking towards what we can change. What would to you be the number one, if you were to introduce one bill, one thing, what would be the number one priority to do right now to help with all those other things that we've mentioned?
I would bring in a universal basic income, because that would give people the security, the foundation. It would take away, we've been talking about toxic politics. It would take away a huge amount of the toxicity if people just basically in their gut know they're secure, know they're going to, we could, more or less abolish food banks. Not necessarily immediately overnight, because it would take time to untie the messes, but if we have a society where no one has to go to a food bank to feed themselves, if we have a society that people know there's a universal basic income that will meet their basic needs every week, no one can hit you with a benefit sanction. If you suddenly lose your job, the situation of the 3 million people with COVID who've just been left utterly high and dry. The government trumpets how much money it's paid out, but there's so many people, millions and millions of people, who've just been left in the most desperate straits, some of whom were actually people who were relatively comfortably off previously. Give people that security. And one of the things that why this is an environmental policy as well as a social policy is what drives an enormous amount of consumption is people feeling profoundly insecure. People want to trade up to the bigger house, so that that's their pension, because no one really trusts the financial sector to deliver a pension. So you can always downsize in your old age, and that means you're secure. People feel like, oh, I've got to keep to be seen to be going ahead at work, and that means I've got to be wearing the latest fashion, look like the kind of person who's really a success, because otherwise I might get snapped off in the 10% of redundancy, and who knows how far I might slide down to the social ladder. Gosh, on the way to work I just stepped over a homeless person. That could be me. You take away that fear, then you really start to create a different kind of society. And I think, UBI is not a sufficient condition for a decent society, but I think it's an essential one. And it's, a foundation of a green society.
That's a great point. Yeah, I feel like we have definitely come full circle on that. So I'm going to thank all the listeners to this when we release it. I'm going to stop the recording now. So thank you, everyone. Hope you
Thanks very
enjoyed
much.
that.